In the sweltering dust of an 1883 Colorado summer, the entire town of Blackwood gathered to laugh at the altar. They thought Wyatt Hayes, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, had lost his mind marrying the soot-stained laundry girl. They were wrong. He was executing the greatest revenge Blackwood ever saw. Blackwood, Colorado, was a town built on silver, greed, and an unyielding social hierarchy. At the very top sat Mayor Archibald Gentry and his wife, Henrietta, a woman whose vanity was matched only by her cruelty. At the very bottom, beneath the miners, the saloon hands, and the drifters, was Josephine Miller. Everyone just called her Josie the Scrubber. Josie's world was defined by the harsh, biting scent of lye, the blistering heat of boiling copper pots, and the relentless ache in her shoulders. She was 22 years old, but her hands looked like they belonged to an old woman, red, cracked, and permanently calloused. She had no family, no history before the age of 7, and no future beyond the steam-filled shack behind the Blackwood Hotel. According to town lore, she'd been found wandering the tracks of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, a traumatized child with nothing but a ragged wool coat and a small, locked mahogany box she refused to let out of her sight. To the town, Josie was a convenience. She was the invisible force that kept the banker's collars stiff and the mayor's wife in pristine petticoats. But invisibility was a luxury Josie rarely enjoyed. More often, she was the town's favorite target for mockery. "Look at her, dragging that basket like a broken mule," Jebediah Cobb, the local blacksmith, would sneer as Josie carried her heavy loads past the saloon. "Careful, Jeb," another would shout. "Don't let her touch you, or you'll catch the stench of poverty." Josie had learned to keep her head down. She hid her face behind the unruly strands of her auburn hair, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. Survival meant silence. Survival meant swallowing her pride every time Henrietta Gentry deliberately dropped a silk dress in the mud, only to demand it be immaculate by morning. But a sweltering Tuesday in late August changed everything. Josie had been scrubbing since before dawn. She was exhausted, her vision blurring from the steam and the oppressive heat. She was carrying a freshly pressed load of garments to the Gentry estate, carefully balancing the woven basket on her hip. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, a stray dog darted out from the alleyway, clipping her ankle. Josie stumbled. The basket tipped. A dozen pristine, snow-white shirts, custom ordered from Philadelphia for Mayor Gentry, tumbled out and landed squarely in a fresh, muddy horse track. Silence fell over the street. The saloon doors stopped swinging. Henrietta Gentry, who had been strolling down the boardwalk with a parasol resting on her shoulder, stopped dead in her tracks. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, aristocratic rage. "You stupid, clumsy wretch!" Henrietta shrieked, her voice echoing off the wooden storefronts. A crowd immediately began to gather, drawn by the scent of a public humiliation. Josie dropped to her knees, frantically trying to brush the wet, dark mud from the fine linen, but it only smeared the stains deeper. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Gentry. I'll boil them again. I'll work through the night." "You will pay for them," Henrietta snapped, stepping forward and bringing the tip of her parasol down hard on Josie's shoulder. Josie flinched, biting back a cry. $30. That is what those shirts cost, but a filthy street rat like you has never seen a single dollar, let alone 30. You'll work for us for free for the rest of your miserable life to pay off this debt." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some chuckled. Josie knelt in the dirt, the hot sun beating down on her back, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. She had reached the end. There was no way out of this. "The girl owes you nothing, Henrietta. The voice was low, smooth, and commanded absolute authority. The crowd parted like water. Stepping off the porch of the assayer's office was Wyatt Hayes. Wyatt was an enigma in Blackwood. He had arrived 3 years prior, quietly buying up the vast, sprawling acres of the Timberline Ridge. He was wealthy, fiercely private, and notoriously intolerant of the town's petty politics. With his dark, piercing eyes and a jawline set in stone, he was a man people instinctively stepped aside for. Henrietta's sneer faltered, replaced by a sickly sweet, nervous smile. "Mr. Hayes, this is a matter between a patron and a thief. She ruined my husband's property." Wyatt walked slowly to where Josie knelt. He didn't look at the ruined shirts. He looked at her. He took in her trembling shoulders, her blistered hands, and the fresh bruise forming where Henrietta had struck her with the parasol. He reached into his tailored waistcoat, pulled out a silver money clip, and peeled off 3 $10 bills. He dropped them into the mud at Henrietta's feet. "There is your money," Wyatt said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now apologize to her." Henrietta gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. "I will do no such thing. She is a laundry girl." "She is a human being," Wyatt corrected, his gaze turning to ice. "And as of this moment, she no longer works for you. She no longer works for anyone in this God-forsaken town." Before the town could process his words, Wyatt knelt in the mud, right ruining his own expensive trousers, and gently took Josie's hands. He looked into her wide, terrified eyes. "Josephine," he said softly, yet loud enough for the dead silent street to hear. "I have a house that needs a woman's touch, but I'm not looking for a maid. I am looking for a wife. Marry me." Someone in the crowd actually fainted. Jebediah Cobb dropped his cigar. Henrietta Gentry stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Josie stared at the handsome, intimidating man holding her bruised hands. She had spoken to Wyatt Hayes exactly twice in her life, both times just a polite exchange of pleasantries when he dropped off his coats. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Wyatt's thumb gently brushed over a burn scar on her knuckles. "Because you deserve to stand up," he replied. "Will you?" Josie looked at the sneering faces of the townsfolk, the people who had treated her like dirt for 15 years. Then she looked at the silver bills in the mud. Finally, she looked into Wyatt's steady, dark eyes. She took a breath that felt like her first taste of real air in a decade. "Yes," she said. They were married 2 hours later in Pastor Miller's parlor. It was a sterile, awkward affair. The pastor stumbled over his words, clearly terrified of crossing the mare by officiating the union, but equally terrified of Wyatt Hayes's cold, unblinking stare. Josie stood at the altar in her best dress, a faded blue cotton gown she had spent hours mending the night before. She smelled of lie and fear. Wyatt stood tall beside her in a dark broadcloth suit, exuding a calm certainty that anchored her. He placed a heavy, solid gold band on her raw finger. It was warm and far too large, but he folded her hand into a fist to keep it from slipping off. "I pronounce you man and wife," the pastor squeaked. There was no kiss. Wyatt merely offered his arm, and Josie took it. As they walked out to Wyatt's waiting carriage, the whispers were already spreading like wildfire. "He's lost his mind. She must have bewitched him. He just wants a cheap bed warmer." Josie heard it all, but for the first time in her life, she was elevated above the dust. She sat on the plush leather seat of the carriage, watching the town of Blackwood shrink in the distance as they ascended the winding mountain road toward Timberline Estate. The estate was breathtaking. A massive, two-story timber and stone house sat nestled against a backdrop of towering pines and snow-capped peaks. It was a fortress of isolation and wealth. When they stepped inside, Wyatt led her up the grand oak staircase. "This is your room," he said, opening the door to a sprawling, sunlit suite. It was filled with fine mahogany furniture, a massive four-poster bed with a down quilt, and a porcelain bathtub behind a dressing screen. It was larger than the entire shack Josie had lived in. "My room is down the hall. No one will disturb you here. I have arranged for a dressmaker to arrive from Denver next week to see to your wardrobe." Josie stood in the center of the room, clutching her small locked mahogany box to her chest, the only possession she had brought from her old life. She felt entirely out of place, like a stray dog invited to dine at a banquet. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice tight. "Wyatt," he corrected gently, leaning against the doorframe. "Wyatt," she tried, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "I don't understand. I'm grateful. You saved me from the gutter today. But men like you do not marry women like me just to be kind. What do you want from me?" Wyatt's expression remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, sadness, regret, passed through his eyes. He stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him. "I married you to protect you, Josie," he said softly, "and because Blackwood is a town of vultures. If Archibald Gentry had discovered what you possess before I could get to you, you would be dead by morning." Josie took a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What I possess? I have nothing. I'm a laundry girl. I don't have a dime to my name." Wyatt's eyes drifted to the wooden box clutched against her chest. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand. Hesitantly, Josie handed it to him. She pulled a small key from a string around her neck and unlocked it. Inside were the meager treasures of a forgotten child: a dried prairie rose, a cracked porcelain doll face, and a heavily tarnished silver pocket watch that didn't tick. Wyatt ignored the rose and the doll. He picked up the watch. He turned it over, tracing his thumb over the intricate, worn engraving on the back. It was a crest, a roaring bear holding a pickaxe, bordered by intertwining ivy. "Do you know what this is?" Wyatt asked. "It was with me when they found me on the tracks," Josie whispered. "It's broken. It's just junk." "It is not junk," Wyatt said, his voice tightening. "This crest belongs to the Sterling Silver Company, specifically to its founder, Arthur Sterling." Josie frowned, confused. "The Sterling mine? The one that dried up 10 years ago?" "It didn't dry up," Wyatt corrected. "Arthur Sterling shut it down. He sealed the main shaft because he struck a vein of pure silver so massive it would have collapsed the local economy and put a target on his back. He was going to sell the land and move his family back east where it was safe. But his train was robbed by a gang of outlaws outside of Blackwood. The train burned. Arthur and his wife perished." Josie felt a cold chill wash over her. Memories, fragmented and hazy, flickered in her mind. The smell of smoke, the sound of shouting, a man in a tailored suit pressing a box into her hands and shoving her out of a boxcar into the dark brush. "They couldn't find Arthur's daughter," Wyatt continued, stepping closer to her. "The Pinkerton Detective Agency spent years looking for her. I spent years looking for her." Josie's breath hitched. You're a detective?" "I was a lawyer for the Sterling estate. Now I manage the trust," Wyatt said. He looked down at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "Your name isn't Josephine Miller, it's Josephine Sterling. And that deed, the legal rights to the largest silver deposit in the state of Colorado, is hidden somewhere in this box." Archibald Gentry has been looking for the Sterling heir for 15 years so he can force a marriage and claim the land. I found you first." Josie stumbled back, hitting the edge of the mattress and sitting down heavily. The room spun. The dirt under her fingernails, the burns on her arms, the years of mockery from Henrietta Gentry. It was all a lie. She wasn't the town scum. She owned the ground they walked on. "Why marry me, then?" Josie demanded, a sudden flare of anger piercing her shock. "If you're a lawyer, why not just reveal who I am? Why the grand display in the mud? Why force a marriage?" Wyatt knelt in front of her, just as he had in the street. "Because Gentry controls the judges in this territory. If I just produced you as the heir, he would have had my claim invalidated, had you declared mentally unfit and seized the assets. As an unmarried woman, you were vulnerable to the town's courts. But as my wife?" Wyatt smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. "As my wife, your assets are protected by the Hayes family name, and Archibald Gentry is terrified of me." He reached out, gently taking her calloused hand in his. "I didn't marry you out of pity, Josie. I married you because we are going to tear Mayor Gentry's corrupt empire to the ground, and I needed you safe by my side to do it." The transition from the boiling copper pots of the Blackwood Hotel to the quiet, mahogany-lined halls of the Timberline estate did not happen overnight. For the first few weeks, Josie still woke before dawn, her heart pounding in a panic, convinced she was late to stoke the laundry fires. She would find herself wandering the sprawling kitchen, her hands instinctively reaching for a scrub brush before she remembered the heavy gold band slipping around her raw finger. Wyatt Hayes did not push her. He gave her space, time, and something far more valuable, an education. If Archibald Gentry realizes who you are before we have the legal framework secure in Denver, he will use every corrupt deputy in this county to invalidate our marriage and declare you an imposter, Wyatt explained one evening in his study. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and aged leather. He slid a thick, leather-bound volume across the desk. "You need to know your father's business. You need to know the law. And you need to know how to defend yourself." And so, the laundry girl became a student. By day, a stern but kind governess named Beatrice Caldwell, brought in quietly from Boston, taught Josie elocution, history, and mathematics. By night, Wyatt taught her the ruthless intricacies of Colorado mining law and the art of the ledger. Josie proved to be fiercely intelligent. The years of suffering had honed her memory. A girl who could memorize the specific starching preferences of 80 different townsfolk had no trouble memorizing property statutes. But the most profound change was the softening of the space between husband and wife. Their marriage had been forged as a shield, a tactical maneuver in a war of vengeance and survival. Yet, as the brutal Colorado winter set in, trapping them in the warmth of the estate, the icy boundaries began to thaw. Wyatt found himself mesmerized by her resilience. He watched her practice with the Colt .45 revolver he had bought for her, her jaw set with a determination that made his chest ache. Josie, in turn, saw past the intimidating, stoic facade of the wealthy lawyer. She saw the man who would sit by the fire and carefully polish the tarnished silver pocket watch that had belonged to her father, treating her broken past with a reverence no one had ever shown her. It was during a blizzard in late November that the secret of the watch finally revealed itself. They were sitting on the Persian rug in front of the roaring hearth. Wyatt was inspecting the back of the watch under a jeweler's glass. "The engraving of the bear," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "It's uneven. The ivy border is deeply etched, but the bear itself is shallow. It doesn't make sense for a master silversmith to make such a blatant error." Josie leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his. The proximity sent a sudden, unexpected thrill down her spine. "My father was a paranoid man, from what you've told me," she said softly. "If he wanted to hide the deed to the Sterling vein, he wouldn't put it in a box easily broken open." Wyatt's dark eyes met hers. He reached for a small, thin awl from his desk. "Hold the casing," he instructed. Josie gripped the cold silver. Wyatt wedged the tip of the awl beneath the shallow engraving of the bear. With a sharp snap, the silver plate popped loose. It was a false back. Josie gasped. Tucked inside the shallow compartment was not a piece of paper, but a tiny, tightly rolled cylinder of vellum and a flat, brass key stamped with the numbers 704. Wyatt unrolled the vellum with agonizing care. It was a ciphered note, written in a microscopic, frantic script. As Wyatt read it, all the color drained from his face. "It's not just the location of the safe deposit box holding the deed," Wyatt whispered, his voice trembling with a rage Josie had never heard from him. "It's a ledger of payouts. Archibald Gentry didn't just want the land, Josie. He was the assayer who evaluated your father's initial samples. He knew what the Sterling mine held, and he is the one who paid Calvin Montgomery and his gang of outlaws to derail your father's train." The roaring of the fire seemed to fade into a hollow ringing in Josie's ears. The mayor. The man whose shirts she had washed, whose wife had beaten her in the street, was the architect of her lifelong misery. He had murdered her parents for silver. "He killed them," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "He left me in the dirt." Wyatt dropped the vellum. He pulled Josie into his arms, crushing her against his chest. It was the first time they had truly embraced. He held her as she sobbed, his large hand stroking her auburn hair. "I swear to you, Josephine," Wyatt murmured into her hair, his voice a lethal vow. "We are going to take everything from him. We are going to strip him down to nothing, and then we are going to let the law hang him." Josie pulled back slightly, looking up into Wyatt's fierce, protective gaze. She didn't see a lawyer. She saw her husband, and for the first time she realized she was entirely, irrevocably in love with him. She wiped her tears with the back of her scarred hand. "No," she said, her voice steadying, "we aren't just going to let the law handle him. I want to look him in the eye when his empire crumbles. I want Henrietta to watch." Spring came to Blackwood with a deceptive brightness, melting the snow and turning the streets to mud. It was the week of the annual Founders' Gala, the most prestigious event in the territory, hosted by Mayor Archibald Gentry at the newly constructed Grand Opera House. The entire town was in attendance, dressed in silks and velvet, drinking imported champagne paid for by bribes and stolen claims. Archibald stood at the center of the ballroom, a diamond stick pin gleaming at his throat, while Henrietta held court near the orchestra, gossiping loudly about the embarrassing absence of Wyatt Hayes and his feral bride. "I hear she still eats with her hands," Henrietta tittered behind her feathered fan to the wife of the local judge. "Mr. Hayes is likely too ashamed to bring the scrubber into polite society. It's a tragedy, really. A man of his stature, brought low by a momentary lapse of sanity." "Is that what you think, Henrietta?" The music seemed to grind to a halt. The chatter in the ballroom died instantly. Standing at the top of the grand sweeping staircase was Wyatt Hayes, looking every inch the aristocratic power broker in a tailored black evening suit. But it was not Wyatt who commanded the room's absolute, breathless silence. It was the woman on his arm. Josie descended the stairs with the grace of a queen. She wore a breathtaking gown of deep emerald silk that perfectly complemented her auburn hair, which was swept up in an elegant, intricate style. Around her neck rested a heavy, dazzling necklace of pure, raw silver. She looked nothing like the terrified, soot-stained girl from the mud. She looked terrifyingly regal. As they reached the ballroom floor, the crowd parted for them as if Moses were parting the Red Sea. Jebediah Cobb's mouth hung open. The judge's wife dropped her champagne glass. Archibald Gentry's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. He stepped forward, blocking their path to the center of the room. "Wyatt," Archibald said, his voice dripping with venom, "I see you've decided to inflict your charity case upon polite society. This is a private event." "It is a town event, Mayor," Wyatt replied coolly, his hand resting reassuringly over Josie's on his arm. "And my wife has every right to be here, more right than anyone else in this room, in fact." Henrietta pushed her way to her husband's side, her face twisted in a sneer. "Right? She is a beggar. She is a thief who ruined my husband's property. You can dress a street rat in silk, Mr. Hayes, but she still belongs in the gutter. Show them your hands, girl. Show them the scabs." Josie did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she removed her white silk evening gloves and handed them to Wyatt. She held her hands out. They were clean, but the deep scars from lie burns and the permanent calluses from years of brutal labor were plainly visible. "You are right, Mrs. Gentry," Josie said, her voice clear, refined, and echoing through the silent hall. "My hands are scarred. They were scarred washing the dirt from your clothes while you lived in a house built on my father's blood." Archibald bristled, taking a threatening step forward. "What is this nonsense? Are you drunk, girl?" Wyatt reached into his coat and withdrew a thick sheaf of legal documents bound in red ribbon. "She is Josephine Sterling," Wyatt announced, his voice booming across the room. "Sole surviving heir to Arthur Sterling, and the legal owner of the Sterling Silver Company, which includes the land this very opera house currently sits upon." Pandemonium erupted. Whispers turned into shouts. Archibald Gentry turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. "Lies!" Archibald bellowed over the noise. "Arthur Sterling's daughter died in the train fire. This is a fraud, a pathetic attempt by a rival lawyer to steal my town." "Your town?" Josie stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the man who had ordered her parents' deaths. The fear that had ruled her for 15 years was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. "You were an assayer, Archibald. You evaluated my father's claim, and when you saw the mother lode, you hired Calvin Montgomery to burn the train." "You have no proof," Archibald spat, though sweat was pouring down his forehead. Wyatt smiled. It was a terrifying sight. "Actually, Archibald, we do. Arthur Sterling kept a ledger of the bribes you paid Montgomery. We found it in his pocket watch, and yesterday morning I handed that ledger, along with the original deed to the Sterling vein, to the federal marshals in Denver." Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the Opera House swung open. 3 United States Marshals, armed with Winchester rifles, stepped into the room. "Archibald Gentry," the lead marshal called out, producing a warrant. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, theft, and the murders of Arthur and Mary Sterling." Henrietta screamed as the marshals grabbed her husband, wrestling his arms behind his back. The townspeople, the same people who had mocked Josie her entire life, watched in stunned silence as the corrupt mayor was dragged out into the muddy street. Henrietta fell to her knees, looking up at Josie with wide, terrified eyes. The parasol she had used to beat Josie months ago lay discarded on the floor. "Josephine, please," Henrietta whimpered, her arrogance shattered. "I didn't know. We will be ruined. Have mercy." Josie looked down at the woman. She felt no pity, but she also felt no need for further cruelty. The scales were balanced. "You owe me $30 for those shirts, Mrs. Gentry," Josie said quietly. "I suggest you learn how to use a scrub board to earn it." Turning her back on the weeping woman, Josie looked up at Wyatt. The stoic lawyer was looking at her with an expression of such profound pride and awe that it made her breath catch. The town of Blackwood faded away. The music, the whispers, the ghosts of her past, all of it dissolved. Wyatt cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing over her cheekbones. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "I had a good teacher," she smiled. Right there, in the center of the grand ballroom, beneath the glittering chandeliers of the empire she had just reclaimed, Wyatt Hayes kissed his wife. It was not a kiss of convenience or a shield against the town. It was a promise, deep and unyielding, of a future built not on the ashes of the past, but on the enduring strength of the woman who had survived it. Today, the Sterling Hayes Foundation stands as Colorado's largest charitable trust, funding schools and orphanages across the state. Blackwood is no longer a town of vultures, but a thriving city of industry. Josephine never erased the scars on her hands. She wore them proudly, a testament to the laundry girl who scrubbed away a corrupt empire and built a dynasty of justice and love from the dirt.